office hours. Virtual office hours is on your syllabus. I have my cell phone. If you're studying, and I do this because I come from a family of teachers, and if you're studying, you're working, you have families, you have responsibilities. If you're studying and you have a question, I don't want you to have to wait 3 days to get it answered. If you're studying and you have a clarification, let's let's get that answered so that you can continue to study on your time. All right. I told you the only exception is if I'm busy or I'm sleeping, but I'll get back with you as soon as possible. Okay. All right, you guys. Today we are going to go into the trunk. We got to do some definitions though. Remember how I said this is, it's an applied anatomy class, but it's also a language class. We just to make sure we're all on the same page. We have all the same structures, but what we call it sometimes can be confusing. For instance, I learned lateral collateral ligament in school, and then when I went to NC State for an internship, they call it the fibula collateral ligament. And I'm like, oh my God, there's this new ligament that I didn't learn about. It's the same thing, right? So the pelvic girdle is formed by several joints, and we talked about it last class. And one of these joints is the sacroiliac joint, where the sacrum and the ilium articulate. There is a little bit of play, just a little bit, kind of similar to what they call a scapular plane, which is just a combination of sagittal frontal. Nothing significant, just a little bit of play, not enough where we give it joint motion. So for the most part, this is again your foundation, your bedrock from which the skyscrapers are built upon. So your sacrum, if you remember, is in anatomy is fused, right? So this is just solid bone. And then you have your coccyx, which is also fused. And then you get into these unfused vertebrae that stack on each other. The key thing with the vertebra, they're irregular, very specialized joints. Dr. Bob used to, he'd have a water balloon, and Dr. Bob would be like, the vertebra on top and the bottom, and you got the water balloon, and they are allowed a little bit of motion. Obviously, this is a very big bulging disc, but they're allowed a little bit of motion, just a little bit. Any two vertebrae just have a little bit of play. Amphiarthrotic, remember, more than none, but not as much as the most. But the sum total of all those little bits, get us some significant motion. It's like collecting change. One day a pocket change may not be enough, but the sum total of several days of pocket change, you might be able to get you a coffee. All right? I don't know about that. Coffee's expensive. So it's very similar. The analogies I like to use a couple of analogies. One is the slinky concept, where you have a slinky that can change directions 180. But it was really the sum total of all the little changes of every rung. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, it doesn't do this, it's gradual change. And the other analogy that works well with me is playing with dominoes. Anybody ever stack dominoes to knock them over? Right? And if you, after a while, going straight gets boring, so you start curving them, but you don't take one domino and the next one you curve it 90 degrees. You got a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, and the sum total of all those little bits changes to 90 degrees, okay? So that's kind of how our trunk works. Now, defining what the trunk is, you have vertebra on the bottom, in the middle, and on the top. You know the top one's is cervical, and we just call them cervical because literally when you move your neck, it's only your cervical vertebrae that are moving. But it's all part of the same skyscraper. Then you have ribs. You start to get ribs at T1 through T12, and that's actually why we separate cervical from thoracic. It's just the fact that these have rib articulations. And then when you run out of rib articulations, that's when you get to lumbar. So that's the difference. If you remember from anatomy, we got 7, 12, and 5, right? Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. Now, like any skyscraper or a tall building, it makes sense that the lowest floors need to be the densest because they have to hold everything on top of them. The top floor doesn't have to be as dense as the bottom floor, right? Because again, the bottom floor has to hold the weight of all of the other floors on top of it. So it's the same thing with our top floors up here aren't very dense because they only have to hold what's on top of it. But the trade-off up here is we're a lot more movable. What you gain in stability, you lose in mobility. What you gain in mobility, you lose in stability. So as we work our way down the skyscraper, the floors are going to get denser and denser and denser because they have to hold more and more and more on top, and they're going to get less and less and less mobile. When you get down to the lumbar, very dense, but not as mobile. It's a gradual continuum of change. Okay? Now, the reason we say trunk and not lumbar is because, again, when you move your head, that's all cervical. But when you move your trunk, it's a combination of thoracic and lumbar. So in other words, even though the lumbar contributions isn't individually as much as the thoracic, they still contribute. Okay, they still contribute. So if I could take this, take that out, and just to show you, we're going to have sagittal plane bend or sway, like imagine a tree kind of swaying sagittally, just like the slinky, okay? And then we're going to have frontal bend or sway. So the sagittal bend and sway, that would look like this. The frontal bend and sway would look like this. And then we have transverse. Now the transverse obviously isn't a bend or a sway, it's a rotation, it's a spin. But again, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer, which one looks different? The bend and the sagittal, where I kind of have general motion. I have rotation and translation. My mass is going forward and down. My mass is coming back and up. Right side, left side. But when I twist, when I rotate, it's this analogy, this, and this. Which one's different, right? So the twisting is going to have a rotation name to it because it's more pure rotation. Trade-off of stability and mobility. Our trunk has to be able to give us motion, but it can't give us too much motion. And the biggest reason for that is you got a lot of plumbing that's happening back here, right? Not just your nerves that are running through those foramen, those naturally forming foramen as we stack these dominoes, but you have blood vessels, arteries, veins, you have a ton of pipeline here. And so again, we have to be able to move, but we can't be hypermobile or that risks getting in the way of our plumbing. Okay. All right. So what I did is I modified the word because there's very similar verbiage with our pelvic girdle and our trunk, except pelvic girdle movements are all rotations. They're all spins. Center of mass of the pelvis. The trunk, because there's general motion involved, we're going to have flexion and extension in the sagittal plane, in the fetal, away from fetal. Flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. Hyper is excessive, beyond your normal range of motion. Frontal, we're going to have a similar verbiage. We have right and left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. For our trunk, we're going to have right and left lateral trunk bending. They used to refer to it, just like I told you with the hips, lateral flexion. But again, that kind of got more confusing because we want to reserve flexions for sagittal. So right lateral and left lateral bending. Imagine, again, it's just like a tree whose trunk is to sway. If a tree didn't sway, it would snap. Giving a little bit actually helps to dissipate force. So we can sway forward and back, flexion and extension. We could sway to our right or to our left. Right lateral, left lateral. And then we can spin to our right and to our left. Right transverse and left transverse. So if I wanted to rotate my trunk to the right, right transverse trunk, left transverse trunk, trunk flexion, trunk extension, right lateral, left lateral. Landmarks. Again, we never want to use global references. We always want to use local references. And the best references to use for the trunk are our ribs. All right, so we got our, what's that? I think the xiphoid process right here. So the middle of our ribs. And our pubic symphysis is a great landmark sagittally. In other words, when my ribs get closer to my pubis, more in the fetal, further away. So keep the landmarks local. This will help you to see the illusions. Like, just because I did this doesn't mean these two pieces got close together. It makes sense? A good frontal plane reference are ribs and pelvis, or ribs and hips. When my left side of my rib gets closer to my left hip, I had the left lateral, and my right gets closer to my right lateral. And then the rotation, again, it's xiphoid or sternum and pubis. If they're lined up, I have it twisted. But if my sternum is now looking to the left, I have to be twisted to the left. If my sternum is looking to the right relative to the pubis, I have to be twisted to the right. Left transverse trunk, right transverse trunk. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. So sagittal, we're going to have trunk flexion and trunk extension. Ribs are going to get closer to the front of the pelvis because you're going to be getting in the fetal. You're not going to get in the fetal like this. Heads up. Right? You want to go here to try to get into a wall. So it still fits our flexion, getting into fetal, getting into a wall. Lindsay, do you want to add anything about that? It looks like it's moving and it is? All right. And I got it. Flexion, extension. Left and right lateral. Left and right transverse.
So you simple if flexion draws at the same time, like their trunk extension.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. An example of that, forgive my lack of ballerina-ness, right hip flexion with trunk extension. Because my trunk can flex or it can extend. Absolutely. Okay. One of the biggest, so it looks like it's moving and it is. Trunk flexion. Trunk extension. Right lateral trunk bending. From left lateral to left lateral from. Right lateral to right lateral from. Think about it. You can do a cartwheel to your right or to your left. Right lateral pelvic, right lateral trunk bending. Left lateral pelvic, left lateral trunk. It's similar vertebrae. Okay. We had right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Well, now we have right transverse trunk rotation. So it looks like it's moving, and it is. Trunk flexion, trunk extension, right lateral, right transverse, left transverse. One of the tricks, or one of the things I'm going to try to teach you, is there's clues in the clothing. There's clues in the clothing. So in other words, if I, let's see, maybe not so much. I hope y'all don't judge me for never matching. It's kind of my thing. Don't match. Look, it's early in the morning when I get up. My wife's still sleeping, so I'm literally pulling clothes blind. That's my excuse. Clues in the clothing, you guys. So what do I mean by that? If I rotate my trunk, if I twist the vertebra in my trunk, watch how my clothes create what we call obliquity. You can literally see the twisting in the clothes, right? Right lateral, you can literally see this get closer. Left lateral, you can literally see this get closer. Now, what I want you to see is illusions it looks like my trunk rotated, but it didn't. And the problem is when you cross-reference local with global. So in other words, someone may say, okay, I got it. Trunk is going to be represented by the sternum, but I'm going to do the sternum in relation to the room. I'll do that. So let me give you an example. If I'm standing and I just do right transverse pelvic girdle rotation and I keep my trunk in anatomical, it might look like my sternum looked to the left, but my trunk didn't rotate. It just went along for the ride. It might look like, in fact, when batters majority of that motion when they swing isn't happening at the trunk, it's happening at the hips and pelvis, and the trunk is literally just going along for the ride. See the difference? Just because my tree does this doesn't mean it's swayed. That's what I just did. Just moved about the hips. See the difference? This is what I did. See the difference? Joint. See the difference? Okay. So it's probably, and again, we're going to practice. You practice. It's probably one of the most difficult things, and that's why we use local landmarks. If you know where you were at, and you could figure out where you went, it's one of Lindsay's original points several weeks ago, then you can kind of prove how you traveled. So in other words, if I start off and my sternum is lined up with my pubis, I know that I'm not twisted. But if all of a sudden I end in a position where I might be twisted, you could say, well, where's the pubis looking? And where's the sternum looking? And how did I have to rotate to get there?
Well, can you, or I guess is it possible, like,
I love these questions.
if you like sitting on range here, not like window, to like fast and it's motion. Would not Trump said he flexed and, like that at the same time?
Absolutely, you can. I'm not going to say you did, but you can. You can have combinational, you can move in combinations. Before we get to combos, though, we have to see north, south, east, west, and up, down before we start traveling northwest and up, southeast and down, right? So 100%, you can go flexion, left lateral, and what would the combination of that look like? And then if you got to rotate, you can also rotate. So our motion is in 3 dimensions. It almost helps to think of it. We analyze motion joint by joint, but even joints that can move in 3 dimensions or multiple dimensions, we need to analyze those motions plane by plane, right? But 100%, if you're sitting down, and you're like, all right, my slinky is to my left side, but it's also in the front. You're like, well, this isn't going to get the slinky. That isn't going to get the slinky. But some of that motion was a left lateral bend, and some of that motion was flexion bend. And when I do them at the same time, makes sense? Great question. So we'll get to those combo things, but it's not, what's the positive is? It's not some new thing. It's just literally like going northeast, Some of that motion's north, some of that motion's east. I'm going forward, but at the same time, I'm going here. And that combination allows me to go at a sagittal frontal combo. All right. Now let's get to the fun stuff. I think it's fun. Call back to pelvic girdle rotations. If I have, this will be good review, and it'll also allow us to develop trunk motion. If I'm here, yoink, I'm here, and I go right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip add and right hip ab. And by the way, you clinicians, being able to manipulate the pelvic girdle and for the hip is going to hurt. When you try to stretch somebody, I mean, that's all pelvic girdle because of hip stuff, right? So there's a lot of uses to see how the pelvis moves relative to the hips. If I go right lateral, but I want to keep my shoulders level because I might be working on something. So if I go right lateral and my shoulders are not level and my eyes are not level, I can bend my trunk back to the left. So maybe I continue working or continue seeing with my eyes level. If I freeze my trunk, freeze Rick, and I rotate my pelvis and move my hips back to anatomical, you can see how I'm bent to the left. That's no different than saying, if I try to rotate this over to the left, and I'm trying to keep the top part level, wouldn't I want to bend back to the right? If I'm trying to keep this level? Like, in other words, if I put a cup of water, or I wedged it and I filled it with water, and all of a sudden this was trying to pour it out the left side, and I wanted to keep water in it, would not bend back to the right. You know, if you've ever worked in food industry, like you're balancing as things trying to make you go one way, you recurl back the other. So it's very similar. We call it a functional circle, meaning we have this bubble that we need to be able to defend, operate, work in. And if it's outside of our bubble, lucky for us, we could just move our bubble. But we need to be able to put our hands or keep our eyes in this mythical bubble. And so again, as my pelvis does right lateral, if my trunk did right lateral, that's okay. I would be trying to grab something off of the ground. That would be summating motion in the same direction for some functional reason. You know, maybe I need to pick up something from the ground. And right lateral isn't getting my hand down enough, so maybe I do want to go right lateral trunk to go with my right lateral pelvis. But if I need to cancel it out in order to stay functional level, if I go right lateral pelvis, I need to bend my trunk back to the left. If I go left lateral pelvis, I need to bend my trunk back to the right. And again, this is subtle. If you're standing and you're waiting patiently and you shift weight, you may not realize it, but your trunk bends. Because if it didn't, it would look like this. If your trunk didn't sway, didn't bend, when you shift weight and your pelvis is trying to tilt water out the right side, if your trunk stayed straight, you would be tilting to the right side. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's important for us to see. Pelvis. My trunk is bent to my left. Because if it wouldn't, it would be here. My trunk is bent to my right. Because if it wouldn't, I would be here.
So essentially, the pelvic That's kind of what you're trying to do.
If you want to stay level, remember there might be times where my pelvis is going anterior, but I want to flex because maybe I'm trying to pick up something off the ground. We never want to say all the time, but if my pelvis is trying to go forward and I'm trying to stay level, I'll extend my trunk if I'm trying to work here. And we're going to get into this next week, how our trunk and our hips work with our pelvis. And this is important for postural things. How many of you ever heard or the term sway back? Sometimes, with gymnasts especially, or certain athletes, their posture has their pelvis tilted anterior, so their hips are flexed. If my trunk doesn't do something about it, I'm going to be here. So how do they correct it? They extend the trunk to keep their shoulders level and eyes level, and it creates this big sway. And if there's no problem, there's no problem, but eventually there may be problems. And therapists, coaches, practitioners need to be able to see pelvic position, thus be able to see, their hips are flexed because the pelvis is rotated forward. And the trunk is extended because if it wasn't, you'd be here all the time. Those things are important to recognize. Okay. All right, let's talk about some more functional circle examples of summation and canceling out. All right, let's say I was trying to look behind me. All right. One option I have, if I hear a sound, I can do this, twist my neck to the right. That only gets me so far. I could twist my trunk to the right. That only gets me so far. And then I could rotate my pelvis to the right. That gets me all the way. The sum total of all of these pieces creates this huge functional circle of sight, of reach. Hand me this. Hand me that. It's the sum total of this, with this, with this. And then another way we have functional circles is canceling out motion. I think one of the first days of class, I mentioned about the jab. The jab, you see the hand translate forward, but it's because my elbow and my shoulder rotated in different directions. The rotations cancel and the translation sum. So imagine, I'm going to use different analogies, but if I don't use an analogy that's in your area of interest, tell me which area of interest is. But imagine a defensive back is backpedaling and they're trying to keep their eyes on the quarterback or the ball. And they need to go from backpedal to turn and run. You got to turn their hips and run. If they turn everything, so in other words, as I rotate my body, I'm going to cancel that out with either trunk or head rotation. It may not look like it. So in other words, I'm going to just kind of do it obvious. If I'm working on the computer and I do this, it may not look like my trunk rotated because you've only been introduced to it. Looks like it's moving and it is options. So what I'm showing you now is my trunk, I know it had to rotate because if it didn't, this is what would have happened. It rotated to the right, to its right. You're like, but Dr. Campbell, how in the world could something spin to the left and yet we say it rotated to the right? Cap and bottom. Sternum in line with pubis. If my sternum is looking at my right hip, it rotated to the right. And if my sternum is looking at my left hip, it rotated to the left. My sternum is looking at what hip? They get to the same place. So it has to be the same motion. Another way to look at it is anatomical, not an anatomical. Hey, trunk, do me a favor, go back home, but use the way that I'm more comfortable with. It looks like it's moving and it is. Trunk is like, yeah, no problem. Left transverse trunk to go back to line up with the pubis. So therefore that motion had to be right transverse trunk when I left home. From here to there is the exact same movement of my trunk as from here to there is what I'm trying to get to. That's the so what. And if you can't see it right away, totally understand. Use the clues. Where are you at? Where did you end up? That's why position is so important. Talking about position, where are you at? Or where did you go? How is the trunk rotated in this new position? It's rotated to the right. It's twisted to the right. So if it goes from not being rotated at all to rotated to the right, I had to have right transverse trunk rotation to get there. Guys, we do this because it's hard. If it was easy, why would you need to be here? If it was easy, they would be handing out degrees in kinesiology alphabetically. We do it because it's hard, so that you guys have a skill set, that you have tools in your toolkit that your competition won't have. I could sit up here and just do the, it looks like it's moving and it is. I bet my teacher evaluations would be good. But no, I choose to show you the harder things for a few reasons. One, it's useful, and I know you can get it. I know you can get it. You just have to help me help you. And that means if you get it, great. And if you don't, ask. All right, guys. This is where I bless you with my amazing art abilities. Much better than mine. Yoink, yoink. Whee! It's in honor of Dr. George. He always used to put the, I don't know what that is. Oh, you know what that is? That's a firework lighter. You know, the little stubs, the little punks, what do they call them? He's putting it in his mouth while he sets the fireworks. Oh, Dr. George, I miss you. All right, guys, check this out. See what I'm trying to get at in my own unique way? If the pelvis goes left lateral, we're going to have left hip ab, right hip ad. And if the pelvis stays, if the trunk stays in anatomical, if the tree doesn't sway, everything that's attached to the bedrock has to go along for the ride. So if I want to keep my shoulders level, I have to bend back the other way. I have to sway back. And the same goes. Does anybody want to get a picture of this? You print it out, I'll sign them. Check this one out. Yoink. George used to always do the big bird nose. And I was like, Dr. George, why do you do that? And he was like, so that you know where they're pointing. So they're facing this way, big bird nose. Perfectly drawn to scale. Y'all think this is water. Anterior pelvic girdle rotation. Hip flexion. If you froze this and brought it back, the hips would be flexed. Cool. Now, if I don't move my trunk, this is what's going to happen. If my trunk stays straight, like if I had a back brace that wouldn't allow trunk motion even if I tried, it's the only option I got. But if I want to keep my shoulders level, I need to sway back the other way. Yes, it looks like an ostrich. It's the best I got. Now, does it have to cancel? No, it can summate. Again, when you tie your shoes, your trunk has a lot less motion than you think. And I'm not talking about like gymnasts or hypermobile people. They may have it all. But remember, you have to move. I quote an old movie called Ocean's 11. So I don't think you guys have ever seen or heard that movie before. You have to move, but you can't move too much. You're protecting too much circuitry. So if I had to tie my shoes, this is all my trunk can give me. Hey, trunk, can you flex to get my hands closer to my feet? Yeah, I got you. Because it can't snap. The trunk can only give you so much. The hips and the pelvis give you a lot more, a lot. So I think sometimes we want to give all the credit to the trunk because, yeah, the trunk is flexed, but the trunk can't flex me all the way down to the floor. So you can summate when there's a functional reason. You need to grab something off the ground. You could do right lateral pelvic and right lateral trunk. You could do anterior pelvic with trunk flexion, but there's some type of functional reason to do so. You could do right transverse with right transverse trunk if there's a functional reason to do so. But you could have right transverse pelvic with left transverse trunk if there's a functional reason to do so. Let's do this. Humor me. Let's see. Man, maybe some of you in witness protection. Your chair swivels. It's a great advantage to this class if you use it wisely. Your chair swivels. So this is what I'd like for you to do. Practice. You're going to have limitations because the black metal bar might be to the right side or to the left side. So there's going to be one range of motion that has a lot more road than the other. That's what I'd like for you to do. Keep your sternum lined up straight with the table. And I want you to either left or right transverse, depending on what you have room for. But keep your sternum facing forward so that your trunk rotates. And I want you to notice the cap and bottle effect. As the pelvis rotates to its right, your trunk is going to rotate to its left. Your sternum is looking at your left hip. If your pelvis rotated to its left, your trunk rotated to its right. Your sternum is looking at your right hip. If your bottle and cap both rotated the same way, you wouldn't be able to open it. They have to spin in opposition for there to be joint motion when one's fixed and the other is moving. If your pelvis and trunk spun to the right, you'd have to move away from the table. And that's just if your pelvis went along for the ride. And if your trunk spun to the right, you'd literally be looking behind you. And sometimes you may need to do that. You might need to spin your pelvis to the left and twist your trunk to the left to grab something different. Does everybody understand? We don't want to use global landmarks. We don't want to use ceiling, floor, ups, downs. We can use local landmarks. We can use local landmarks like the sternum, pelvis. All right, last ones for today. Also, I would suggest just trying to keep up with the material, guys. If you wait till the last minute, it will get overwhelming. Study now, view it now, ask questions now, text me for clarification now or this weekend. Okay. Last ones. I would love for you to be able to tell me if, maybe not, did the pelvis rotate? Did it rotate about the hips? Did the hips rotate? And then go to trunk. I'm not telling you any of that stuff happens. I'm saying that's what's fair game. Okay, I'm going to give you a movement, and then you have to tell me what you observe. Open-ended question. Start. Finish. That's the thought. Got to shake the edge of sketch. Was there pelvic girdle rotation? Yes. If so, how? Right transverse pelvic. Good. What spun the basketball? What joints rotated the pelvis? The hips. Right? How did the hips rotate? Right hip internal, left hip external. Did the trunk move? No. Trunk went along for the ride. If I did, think of it like this. If I did have trunk motion, you would see one of two things. This or this. Left transverse would have kept me functionally forward. Right transverse would have functionally brought me behind. I want another one? Okay. All right, how about this one? Also a reminder, I'm never ever going to ask you a motion that did this. It's always going to be obvious change. All right, guys, I'd love to give you more time, but I want to try to get to one more example, okay? Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip abduction. Left hip didn't do anything, trunk didn't do anything. If the trunk would have done something, been to the right or been back to the left.
What's this for? There's no front motion.
Oh, you can. I'm just
Well,
giving you,
yeah.
yeah. Remember, I'm just giving you examples. I didn't have it there, but I could have done this. But I chose to do this. You know, it's your instinct wants to have rules, and there are rules, but with rules come simulations that could or couldn't happen, and that's what I'm trying to work on. All right, last one for the day. I'm giving you some information. My bowl is pouring water out of the front. I'm anteriorly tilted. My pelvis is rotated anteriorly to start, okay? So what I'd like for you to do is say, okay, well, if I'm pouring water out of the front, what does that mean for my hips? And what does that mean for my trunk? That's the first question. And then from here, you observe this motion. Start, finish. Start, finish. I want you to tell me pelvic girdle rotation. I want you to tell me hip motion, and I want you to tell me trunk motion. Last question of the day. So I start here. So now I start. And then I do this. Lindsay, when you learned this stuff, did you feel like almost kind of empowered when you're at the clinic or when you're like, it's cool, right? Like, it's like unlocking new levels, you know, in the game. All right, you guys, here's what we did. We always want to start with the pelvis and then work off of the pelvis, okay? Pelvis started anteriorly tilted and it finished posterior. It had posterior pelvic girdle rotation, okay? The reason the pelvis rotated posteriorly is because my hips went from a flexed position to an extended position, so I have bilateral hip extension. Now, the trunk started off in an extended position and it ended in a flexed position. So I went from being extended to being flexed. I had to have trunk flexion. You see that? And next week, we're going to get into, have you ever heard of reverse crunches, right? All that is taking the pelvis and doing trunk flexion and trunk extension. But instead of bending the slinky this way, we're just bending the slinky this way. It's the same bend. Same as this. This is the same as this. We'll get into lateral bends. Taking the slinky this way is the same bend as taking the slinky that way. Last thing I'll say, and again, Lindsay, add in if you want. Try to stay up with it, guys. The first test was easy. I'm being honest. First test is a gimme. This one is much more complicated, so try to stay up with it. Y'all have a good one, guys. Have a safe weekend.